The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Silver Spring, Wyoming Territory, 1872, but it wasn't the sound that made Bethany Lawson flinch, it was the jeers that followed as she hurried down the boardwalk, one hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly. "There goes the whore with no husband," someone called out, the words cutting through the morning air like a knife. Bethany kept her eyes forward, clutching her meager groceries tighter as she quickened her pace. At 22, she had never imagined she'd be 6 months pregnant, alone, and the subject of an entire town's scorn. But life in the West had a way of appending expectations, just as it had the day her fiancé's stagecoach was ambushed by road agents 4 months earlier. The boarding house where she rented a small back room came into view, and Bethany released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Just a few more steps, and she could escape the burning stairs and whispered accusations. The wooden steps creaked beneath her weight as she climbed to the porch. "Mrs. Penbrook says your rent's due tomorrow," a voice called from the doorway. The landlady's daughter, barely 16 and already schooled in her mother's contempt, blocked Bethany's path. "She says if you can't pay, you need to find other accommodations." Bethany nodded, not trusting her voice. The sewing work she'd been doing had dwindled as her pregnancy progressed, not because her stitches were any less fine, but because the respectable women of Silver Spring didn't want garments touched by hands they considered unclean. "I'll have it," she managed, though she wasn't sure how. The girl stepped aside, her eyes dropping to Bethany's stomach with undisguised disgust before she disappeared inside. Bethany followed slowly, making her way to her tiny room at the back of the house. The space barely fit a narrow bed and a small table, but it was all she had. Placing the groceries, a small sack of beans, some flour, and a bruised apple the grocer had sold her at half price on the table, Bethany sank onto the edge of the bed. Her fingers traced the simple gold band she still wore, the only evidence that Daniel had existed at all. The tears came then, as they often did when she was finally alone. On the other side of town, Jackson Northrop dismounted from his horse in front of the general store. At 31, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that came from years of working the land. His ranch, the Double N, lay 10 miles outside of town, and he rarely made the trip unless necessary. Today, he needed supplies and had a meeting with the bank about expanding his cattle operation. "Afternoon, Jackson," called Henry Miller, the store owner, as he entered. "What brings you to town?" "Just the usual," Jackson replied, handing over his list. "How have things been?" Henry's expression turned sour. "Same as always. Though that Lawson woman is still causing a stir. Pregnant and unwed, parading around like she's got nothing to be ashamed of." Jackson said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He'd heard the gossip, of course, but had never laid eyes on the woman in question. It wasn't his business, and he had enough to worry about with his ranch. "Word is she can't pay her rent at the boarding house," Henry continued, gathering Jackson's supplies. "Good riddance, I say. Town's got standards. Seems to me a woman in her condition could use some Christian charity," Jackson said evenly, not judgment. Henry looked surprised, then shrugged. "You've always been soft-hearted, Jackson. But some women make their bed and have to lie in it." Jackson paid for his supplies and left without further comment. The encounter left a bad taste in his mouth. He'd seen how quickly frontier towns could turn on those who didn't fit their narrow view of propriety, regardless of circumstances. As he secured his purchases to his saddle, a commotion across the street caught his attention. A young woman was backing away from the boarding house, her arms wrapped protectively around her pregnant belly as the landlady shouted after her. "I told you yesterday was your last chance. I run a respectable establishment. Take your shame elsewhere." A small valise had been tossed onto the boardwalk at the woman's feet, and even from this distance, Jackson could see she was trembling. She bent awkwardly to retrieve the bag, and when she straightened, Her eyes briefly met his across the dusty street. In that moment, something shifted in Jackson's world. Her face was pale but proud, her eyes clear despite the obvious distress, and he found himself moving toward her before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat as he approached. "Looks like you might need some assistance." Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd initially thought, with auburn hair tucked beneath a simple bonnet and eyes the color of spring sage. Those eyes now regarded him warily. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Jackson Northrop," he introduced himself. "I own the Double N ranch outside of town. If you're in need of a place to stay, I might be able to help." Her expression hardened instantly. "I'm not looking for that kind of arrangement, Mr. Northrop." It took him a moment to understand her meaning, and when he did, he felt his face grow warm. "No, madam, nothing like that. My housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, has been asking for help with the household duties. It's just her, me, and a couple of ranch hands. You'd have your own room, and it would be honest work." Uncertainty flickered across her features. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Jackson glanced at the gathering crowd of onlookers, some openly jeering. "Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere less public?" After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, and he guided her toward the small park at the end of the street, carrying her valise. They settled on a bench beneath an elm tree, far enough from prying ears. "I'm Bethany Lawson," she finally said. "And I appreciate your offer, but I'm sure you've heard the rumors. I wouldn't want to bring scandal to your home." "Mrs. Lawson, miss," she corrected, then touched the ring on her finger. "Daniel and I were to be married when he returned from Cheyenne. The stagecoach was attacked. He never made it back." Jackson nodded slowly. "I'm sorry for your loss." "As am I," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But no one here believes me. Or if they do, they don't care. An unmarried woman expecting a child is beyond forgiveness, apparently." "Not everyone feels that way," Jackson said. "My offer stands. Mrs. Finch is getting on in years, and the ranch house is too much for her alone. The position includes room, board, and a small wage." Bethany studied him, clearly searching for any sign of deception. "Why would you do this? You must know how people will talk." Jackson smiled slightly. "Miss Lawson, my ranch is 10 miles from town. I visit maybe once a month. What people say concerns me very little." She looked down at her hands, considering. "And what about when the baby comes?" "Then the ranch will have one more resident," he said simply. "Babies are a blessing, Miss Lawson." For the first time, Bethany's composure cracked, and tears filled her eyes. She quickly blinked them away. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Jackson suggested. "Unless you have another option?" They both knew she didn't. With no money, no family, and a town that had turned its back on her, Bethany had reached the end of her rope. "Yes," she finally said. "Thank you, Mr. Northrop." An hour later, after Jackson had finished his business at the bank, they set out for the Double N Ranch. Bethany rode in front of him on his horse, her small valise tied behind the saddle. The journey was mostly silent, both lost in their own thoughts about how quickly their circumstances had changed. As they crested the final hill, the ranch came into view, a sturdy 2-story house, a large barn, and various outbuildings spread across a valley with mountains rising in the distance. Cattle dotted the grasslands, and a small creek wound through the property. "It's beautiful," Bethany murmured. "It's home," Jackson replied simply, guiding the horse toward the house. Mrs. Finch, a stout woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, met them on the porch, her expression curious but not unkind. "Mrs. Finch, this is Miss Bethany Lawson. She'll be helping you with the household duties," Jackson explained as he helped Bethany dismount. To her credit, Mrs. Finch's eyes only widened slightly at the sight of Bethany's condition before she nodded. "Well, it's about time," Come inside, Miss Lawson. You look like you could use some tea and a proper meal. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, smelling of fresh bread and something savory simmering on the stove. Bethany sank gratefully into a chair at the large wooden table while Mrs. Finch bustled about, chattering as she prepared tea. The room next to mine upstairs is ready for you. It's small but comfortable. Mr. Northrop mentioned your condition when he sent word ahead with one of the hands. When are you due, dear? Late October, Bethany replied, surprised by the matter-of-fact acceptance. Perfect timing. The harvest will be done, and things slow down a bit around here in winter. Mrs. Finch placed a steaming cup of tea and a plate of bread with preserves in front of her. Now eat. You're too thin for a woman in your state. As Bethany ate, Jackson excused himself to tend to the horses, and Mrs. Finch continued her running commentary about the ranch and its routines. For the first time in months, Bethany felt the knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. Perhaps here, away from the judgmental eyes of Silver Spring, she could find some peace. Later that evening, after she'd been shown to her room, a simple but clean space with a comfortable bed, a small dresser, and a rocking chair by the window, Bethany unpacked her few belongings. The exhaustion of the day caught up with her, and she sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by how quickly her circumstances had changed. A soft knock at the door roused her. Mrs. Finch stood there with a bundle of fabric in her arms. "I thought you might need these," she said, entering and placing the items on the bed. "Some of my dresses from when I was younger. They might need letting out a bit for your condition, but they'll serve better than what you have." Bethany touched the fabric, sturdy cotton in practical colors, but of good quality. "Thank you. I can pay you when I receive my wages." Mrs. Finch waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. They've been gathering dust for years." She hesitated, then added, "Mr. Northrop told me about your situation. He's a good man, despite what folks in town might say." "What do they say about him?" Bethany asked, curious. "Oh, that he's standoffish, too serious. Some call him cold." Mrs. Finch snorted. "They don't know him. Lost his parents young, built this place from almost nothing. He keeps to himself, but there's not a more decent man in the territory." After Mrs. Finch left, Bethany stood at the window, looking out at the ranch bathed in the golden light of sunset. In the distance, she could see Jackson by the corral, talking with one of the ranch hands. He seemed at ease here, confident in a way he hadn't been in town. For the first time in months, Bethany allowed herself to feel something like hope. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the baby move beneath her palm. "We might be okay after all," she whispered. The first weeks at the double and settled into a rhythm. Bethany helped Mrs. Finch with cooking, cleaning, and mending, careful not to overexert herself. The older woman proved to be a wealth of practical knowledge about childbirth and infant care, information Bethany absorbed eagerly. Jackson was often out working on the ranch from dawn until dusk, but at mealtimes, he made a point of engaging Bethany in conversation, asking about her day and sharing news of the ranch operations. She learned he'd come west from Pennsylvania after the war, determined to build something of his own. "My father was a shopkeeper," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset. "Always wanted me to take over the business, but I couldn't see myself spending my life indoors." "How did you end up here specifically?" Bethany asked. Jackson's expression softened with memory. "Passed through during the war. The regiment I served with was moved from east to west. I saw this valley, and something about it just felt right. When I had saved enough after the war, I came back and bought the land. It's a beautiful place," Bethany said sincerely. "You've built something remarkable." A faint color touched Jackson's cheeks at the compliment. "It's still a work in progress. But thank you." As her pregnancy advanced, Bethany found herself increasingly confined to the house and immediate surroundings. The baby was active, especially at night, making sleep difficult. One such restless night, she made her way downstairs to the kitchen, hoping a glass of milk might help. To her surprise, Jackson was there, shirt sleeves rolled up, working on something at the table. Wood shavings littered the floor around him. "I'm sorry," she said, startling him. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Jackson quickly stood, setting aside his tools. "You're not interrupting. Just couldn't sleep." Bethany moved closer, curious about his project. On the table lay the beginnings of what appeared to be a small wooden cradle. "You're making a cradle?" she asked, her voice catching. Jackson nodded, suddenly looking uncertain. "I thought. Well, the baby will need somewhere to sleep." "If you prefer to get something from town, no," Bethany interrupted, reaching out to touch the smooth wood. "It's beautiful. I just didn't expect." "Thank you." "It's not finished yet," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I've been working on it at night. Wanted it to be a surprise." Bethany blinked back tears. "It's the kindest thing anyone has done for me since Daniel died." They stood in silence for a moment, the mention of Daniel's name hanging between them. It was the first time she'd spoken of him directly to Jackson. "He was a lucky man," Jackson finally said quietly. "To have been loved by you." This simple statement, delivered without judgment or expectation, broke something open inside Bethany. The tears she'd been holding back spilled over, and before she knew what was happening, Jackson had guided her to a chair and was kneeling beside her, his large hand covering hers. "I'm sorry," she managed between sobs. "I don't apologize," he said gently. "You've been carrying too much alone." When her tears finally subsided, Jackson fetched the glass of milk she'd originally come for. As she sipped it, he returned to his work on the cradle, his strong hands moving with surprising delicacy over the wood. "Would you tell me about him?" Jackson asked after a while. "Daniel?" The question surprised her, but Bethany found herself wanting to share. "He was a schoolteacher. Came west because he believed education was needed here most. We met when I was working at the dressmaker's shop in Silver Spring." She smiled at the memory. "He was having a vest mended and kept finding excuses to come back for adjustments." Jackson smiled too, continuing to work as she talked. The simple act of sharing Daniel's memory without seeing pity or judgment in her listener's eyes was cathartic. For the first time, Bethany felt she could remember the joy of having known Daniel without being crushed by the pain of losing him. As weeks passed, Jackson continued working on the cradle at night. Sometimes Bethany would join him, keeping him company while she sewed baby clothes from fabric Mrs. Finch had found in the attic. These quiet nighttime hours became a sanctuary for them, both, a time when guards were lowered and conversations flowed freely. One evening in early October, with the cradle nearly complete, Jackson worked up the courage to ask the question that had been on his mind. "The cradle," he began hesitantly. "I was thinking it might be practical to place it beside my bed." Bethany's hands stilled in her lap. "I don't understand." Jackson set down his tools, meeting her eyes directly. "I've come to care for you, Bethany, and for your child. I know it might seem sudden or that I'm overstepping, but I would like to offer you my name. For protection, for security." Bethany's heart raced. "Are you proposing marriage?" "I am," he confirmed. "It would be a marriage of convenience, of course. I wouldn't expect. That is, there would be no obligation beyond what you're comfortable with." "Why would you do this?" she asked, echoing her question from the day they'd met. Jackson's expression was earnest. "Because you deserve better than what the world has handed you. Because your child deserves a father. And selfishly, because having you here has made this house feel like a home for the first time." Bethany was speechless. The offer was generous beyond measure, but she couldn't help wondering if acceptance would be fair to Jackson. "You should have a wife who comes to you without complications," she finally said. "Someone who can give you children of your own." "This child would be mine in every way that matters," Jackson replied. "As for complications, life is complicated, Bethany. I'm not looking for perfect. I'm looking for real." "May I have time to think about it?" she asked. "Of course," he said, returning to his work on the cradle. "Take all the time you need." For 3 days, Bethany wrestled with Jackson's proposal. She couldn't deny she'd developed feelings for him, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the way he looked at her as if her pregnancy enhanced rather than diminished her beauty. But was it enough to build a marriage on? On the 4th day, as they walked together near the creek after supper, Bethany made her decision. "If the offer still stands," she said, stopping to face him, "I would be honored to become your wife." Relief and joy transformed Jackson's features. "The offer very much still stands. But I have conditions," Bethany continued. "I want a real marriage, Jackson. Not just a name. I want us to build something genuine between us. And I want you to be sure this is what you want." Jackson took her hands in his. "I've never been more certain of anything." They were married the following Sunday by the circuit preacher who visited the ranch once a month. It was a simple ceremony, attended only by Mrs. Finch and the ranch hands, but to Bethany, it felt perfect. She wore one of Mrs. Finch's altar dresses, her hair adorned with wildflowers Jackson had picked that morning. That night, Jackson carried the finished cradle into the master bedroom, placing it beside the bed as he'd proposed. The craftsmanship was exquisite smooth pine, with intricate carvings of stars and moons along the sides. "It's perfect," Bethany said, running her fingers over the detailed work. "Not quite," Jackson replied, retrieving something from his dresser. He handed her a small pillow covered in soft flannel. Mrs. Finch helped with this part. Bethany placed the pillow in the cradle, completing the picture. Tears pricked her eyes again, happy ones this time. "Our baby's first bed." Jackson's arms encircled her from behind, his hands resting gently on her rounded belly. "Our baby," he repeated, the wonder in his voice unmistakable. Their marriage bed was approached with tenderness that night, both nervous but eager to begin their life together truly as husband and wife. Jackson's gentleness and patience helped Bethany overcome her initial shyness, and in his arms, she discovered a passion she hadn't known she possessed. Afterward, lying in the circle of his embrace, Bethany felt a contentment she'd thought lost forever. "I never expected to find this again," she confessed. "To feel safe, to feel loved." Jackson kissed her forehead. "I'll spend every day making sure you never lose that feeling again." 2 weeks later, in the early hours of a crisp October morning, Bethany went into labor. Mrs. Finch took charge immediately, sending one of the ranch hands for the midwife who lived on a neighboring property. Jackson paced anxiously outside the bedroom door until Mrs. Finch ordered him to make himself useful by boiling water and preparing clean linens. The labor was long and difficult. By mid-afternoon, Bethany was exhausted, her strength flagging. The midwife exchanged worried glances with Mrs. Finch and finally, against traditional protocol, allowed Jackson into the room. He went straight to Bethany's side, taking her hand and wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "You're the strongest person I know," he told her. "You can do this." Drawing strength from his presence, Bethany found her second wind. An hour later, amid tears and laughter, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that left no doubt about her fighting spirit. "She's perfect," Jackson whispered, watching in awe as the midwife placed the swaddled infant in Bethany's arms. "Would you like to hold your daughter?" Bethany asked, offering the tiny bundle to him. Jackson took the baby with trembling hands, cradling her as if she were made of the finest porcelain. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your paw." The simple declaration brought fresh tears to Bethany's eyes. In that moment, watching Jackson with their daughter, she knew without doubt that the feelings growing between them were much more than convenience or gratitude. She was falling in love with him, perhaps had been since that first day in Silver Spring when he'd offered help when no one else would. They named her Hope Elizabeth Northrop, a name that spoke of new beginnings and remembered roots. That night, As Hope slept in the cradle beside their bed, Jackson and Bethany lay awake, hands intertwined, marveling at how their lives had changed in the span of a few short months. "I never thought I'd have this," Jackson confessed in the darkness. "A family of my own. After the war, I convinced myself the ranch was enough." Bethany squeezed his hand. "And now I wonder how I ever thought so," he replied. "You and Hope. You filled spaces in my heart I didn't even know were empty." The weeks that followed were a blur of adjustment as they settled into life with a newborn. Hope proved to be a good-natured baby, with Daniel's dark hair and Bethany's green eyes. Jackson was an attentive father, often carrying Hope in a sling across his chest while he handled ranch business close to the house. As winter descended on the valley, the little family cocooned in the warmth of the ranch house. In the evenings, they would gather in the sitting room, Mrs. Finch knitting by the fire, Jackson reading aloud from one of his books, Bethany nursing Hope in the rocking chair he'd made to match the cradle. It was during one such evening in early December that Jackson received word that a supply wagon would be heading into Silver Spring the next day. They needed provisions that couldn't wait until spring, and Jackson decided to make the journey himself. "I'll come with you," Bethany said, surprising them both. She hadn't set foot in town since the day she'd left. "Are you sure?" Jackson asked. "The journey will be cold, and Hope is still so young." "We'll bundle her well," Bethany replied with determination. "Besides, it's time I stopped hiding." The next morning, they set out in the wagon, Hope securely wrapped against the cold and nestled between them. The journey took longer than usual due to the snow-covered roads, but by early afternoon, they reached the outskirts of Silver Spring. Bethany felt her stomach tighten with anxiety as the familiar buildings came into view. Jackson, sensing her discomfort, reached over to take her hand. "Remember, you're Mrs. Northrop now. You have nothing to be ashamed of." His words bolstered her courage. As they drove down Main Street, heads turned and whispers started. Jackson pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a general store, helping Bethany down with a deliberate show of attentiveness that made his position clear to any onlookers. Inside the store, Henry Miller's eyes widened at the sight of them. Bethany with a wedding ring on her finger and a baby in her arms, Jackson standing protectively beside them. "Mr. Northrop," Henry greeted, his gaze darting between them. "And Mrs. Northrop, I presume." "That's right," Jackson confirmed, his voice leaving no room for questions. "We need supplies for the winter." As Jackson handed over his list, other customers entered the store, including Mrs. Penbrook, Bethany's former landlady. The woman stopped short at the sight of Bethany, her expression souring. "Well, I see you found yourself a solution," she said tartly. Before Bethany could respond, Jackson turned. "My wife and I found each other," he corrected, his tone pleasant but firm. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have business to attend to." Mrs. Penbrook huffed and moved to another part of the store, but not before Bethany caught the flash of jealousy in the older woman's eyes. It was then Bethany realized something important. The town's judgment had never truly been about morality. It had been about the ancient currencies of envy and fear. They completed their shopping and visited the bank, where Jackson introduced Bethany as his wife with such pride that the banker, who had once refused to speak directly to her, now treated her with cautious respect. As they prepared to leave town, Bethany asked Jackson to stop at the small cemetery on the edge of Silver Spring. With Hope bundled in her arms, she stood before Daniel's simple grave marker, Jackson a respectful distance behind her. "I brought someone for you to meet," she said softly to the stone. "Your daughter, Hope. She has your smile already." Bethany swallowed hard. "And I wanted you to know I'm okay now. Better than okay. I've found happiness again, with a good man who loves Hope as his own." She glanced back at Jackson, who watched her with understanding in his eyes. "I'll always remember you, Daniel. Always. But I'm moving forward now." The ride home was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As the ranch came into view, Bethany felt a profound sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with the buildings and everything to do with the man beside her. "Thank you for today," she said. "For standing by me." Jackson's expression was solemn. "I will always stand by you, Bethany. Always." That night, after Hope was fed and sleeping soundly in her cradle, Bethany joined Jackson in their bed with a new sense of freedom. The ghosts of the past hadn't been exorcised entirely, but they had been acknowledged and honored, making room for the present and future. "I love you," she said for the first time, the words coming easily now that she'd cleared the final hurdle of her past. "I think I have for some time now." Jackson's face lit with joy. "I've loved you since I saw you standing on that boardwalk, refusing to be broken by their cruelty." He gathered her close. "You're the bravest person I know, Bethany Northrop." Spring came to the valley with a riot of wildflowers and the births of new calves. Hope, now 6 months old, was sitting up and reaching for everything within her grasp. The cradle had been moved to a corner of the bedroom, replaced by a larger crib Jackson had built as she outgrew her first bed. On a warm April morning, Bethany sat on a blanket spread beneath the old oak tree near the house, watching Hope play with a wooden rattle. Jackson rode up from the pasture, dismounting with the easy grace that still made Bethany's heart skip. He joined them on the blanket, Hope immediately crawling toward him with delighted babbles. "She's getting faster," he observed, scooping her up and blowing a raspberry on her chubby cheek. Hope's laughter, a relatively new and completely enchanting sound, rang out. "Soon she'll be running us both ragged," Bethany agreed. Jackson settled Hope on his lap, his expression turning more serious. "I've been thinking about something. You mentioned once that Daniel came west because he believed education was needed here most." Bethany nodded, curious where this was leading. "The nearest school is 20 miles away," Jackson continued. "There are at least a dozen children within a 5-mile radius of our ranch who aren't getting any formal education." "What are you suggesting?" Bethany asked, though she had an inkling. "The old bunkhouse near the creek. We could convert it into a schoolhouse." Jackson looked at her intently. "And I was thinking you might consider teaching. You mentioned you helped Daniel prepare his lessons sometimes." Bethany was speechless for a moment. "You'd build a school?" "For our community. For Hope, eventually." Jackson's expression softened. "And for Daniel's memory, in a way. Continuing what he believed in." Tears blurred Bethany's vision. "I think that's the most beautiful idea I've ever heard." By September, the schoolhouse was ready, a simple but sturdy building with large windows to let in natural light, desks built by Jackson and his men, and a small bell in a tower to call the children to lessons. 8 students enrolled for that first term, ranging in age from 6 to 14, all from neighboring ranches and farms. On the first day of school, Bethany stood nervously at the front of the room, watching as the children settled into their seats. Jackson had insisted on attending, sitting at the back with Hope on his knee, his presence a silent vote of confidence. "Welcome to our school," Bethany began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Here, we'll learn reading and writing, arithmetic and history. But more importantly, we'll learn to think for ourselves and to treat each other with kindness and respect." As she looked at the eager young faces before her, Bethany felt a sense of purpose that went beyond her roles as wife and mother. This was her contribution to their community, her way of honoring both her past and her present. That evening, after the children had gone home and Hope was asleep, Bethany and Jackson sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the valley in hues of gold and pink. "You were magnificent today," Jackson said, his arm around her shoulders. "Those children are lucky to have you as their teacher." Bethany leaned into his embrace. "I'm the lucky one. A year ago, I was alone and desperate, with no future I could see. Now I have everything I could have wished for: a husband I love, a beautiful daughter, meaningful work. And it's just the beginning," Jackson promised, his hand finding hers. "We have our whole lives ahead of us." As if to emphasize his point, Bethany guided his hand to rest on her stomach. "We might need to expand that Cradle collection sooner than we thought." Jackson's eyes widened. "Are you saying?" Bethany nodded, laughing at his expression of stunned joy. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday when he came to check on Mrs. Peterson's boy. Another Northrop will be joining us come spring." Jackson pulled her into a kiss that conveyed everything words couldn't: his love, his gratitude, his promise for their future. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'll start on another Cradle tonight." 5 years later, the Double N Ranch had transformed. The house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. Hope, now 6 and starting school herself, William, 4 and constantly trailing after his father, and twins Emma and Elijah, just celebrating their 2nd birthday. The school had grown as well, with 20 students now and a second teacher hired to help Bethany, who divided her time between teaching and managing their bustling household. Jackson had built a proper schoolhouse to replace the converted bunkhouse, and it stood as a source of pride for the entire community. On a crisp autumn afternoon, much like the one when Bethany had first come to the ranch, the family gathered on the porch for a photograph, a new technology that had finally reached their part of Wyoming. The photographer from Cheyenne arranged them carefully, Jackson standing tall with William on his shoulders, Bethany seated with a twin on each knee, and Hope standing beside her mother, one hand resting on Bethany's shoulder. "A beautiful family," the photographer commented as he prepared his equipment. "You must be very proud, Mr. Northrop." Jackson looked at Bethany, their eyes meeting in a glance that spoke of all they had built together. "More than I could ever express," he replied. Later, as the children played in the yard under Mrs. Finch's watchful eye, Jackson took Bethany's hand and led her to the old oak tree where they'd sat that day he proposed building the school. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, intricately carved with the same star and moon pattern as Hope's cradle. "Open it." Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a gold locket. Bethany opened it to find a tiny painting of their family on one side and an inscription on the other. "From cradle to forever, my heart is yours." "Jackson," she breathed, tears threatening. "I wanted to give you something to mark our 5th wedding anniversary," he explained. "Something to remind you of how far we've come." Bethany let him fasten the locket around her neck, the weight of it settling against her heart. "I don't need reminders," she said softly. "Every time I look at our children, at our home, at you, I remember." Jackson pulled her into his arms, his embrace as sure and steady as it had been the first time he'd held her. "Do you ever think about that day in Silver Spring? When everything changed?" Bethany nodded against his chest. "Sometimes. It felt like the end of the world then. I couldn't see how anything good could come from such pain and humiliation. And now—" She pulled back to look up at him, her hand coming to rest on his cheek. "Now I know that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one." From the house, they heard the twins' laughter and Hope calling for them to come see the new kitten the barn cat had produced. Life was calling them back, beautiful, messy, perfect life. "We should go in," Bethany said, though she made no move to leave the circle of his arms. Jackson smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We have time. All the time in the world." And they did. Years stretched ahead of them, filled with the ordinary miracles of family life, children growing, seasons changing, love deepening through trials and joys alike. The cradle that had once seemed a symbol of Bethany's shame had become instead the foundation of a life neither she nor Jackson could have imagined when they'd first met that fateful day on the streets of Silver Spring. It stood now in the attic, carefully preserved, waiting for the day when Hope or one of her brothers or sister might need it for a child of their own. And when that day came, They would tell the story of how a single act of kindness in a cruel world had changed everything, how a cradle built with love had become the cornerstone of a family's legacy.